It is early morning on June 4th, 1942. Above the calm blue waters of the Pacific, a storm is brewing. On board the USS Enterprise, the sailors are preparing for a mission they know will change the course of history. Thousands of miles away, in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy is steaming forward, unaware of the disaster that awaits. Their carriers, brimming with planes and anticipation, are on a collision course with the American fleet. The Japanese officers, brimming with confidence, still believe their fleet is invincible. But as the sun climbs higher in the sky, their world is about to be shattered. Within hours, they will realize that the American aircraft carrier, once underestimated, has become the most fearsome weapon on the planet. It will mark a turning point in the Pacific War, where the tides of battle shift and Japan's naval supremacy is forever broken. The rise of aircraft carriers and the prelude to conflict. By the late 1930s, the world was on the brink of chaos. The great powers of the world were arming themselves, preparing for the inevitable clash that would become World War II. Among these, Japan had aggressively expanded its military ambitions across East Asia, determined to secure its place as a dominant force in the Pacific. The United States, still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression, was beginning to rebuild its military might. The Japanese Imperial Navy, already one of the world's most formidable, relied heavily on battleships as the backbone of its naval strategy. The Yamato-class battleships, massive, heavily armored, and bristling with firepower, embodied the might of the Imperial Navy. To Japan's leadership, battleships were the epitome of naval supremacy. However, the United States was starting to invest heavily in a new, revolutionary weapon, the aircraft carrier. In 1922, the Washington Naval Conference had set limits on the number of battleships each country could possess. The United States, seeing the writing on the wall, began to focus on the development of aircraft carriers as a means of projecting power across vast distances without the limitations of traditional battleships. The USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, both commissioned in the late 1930s, were early examples of the U.S. Navy's shift in thinking. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, aircraft carriers had already demonstrated their potential in the early stages of the war, but the full scale of their power had yet to be realized. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a devastating success for Japan, but it also opened a critical flaw in their strategy. Despite crippling the American fleet's battleships, Japan had inadvertently left untouched the most vital part of the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carriers. Unbeknownst to the Japanese officers, these carriers would soon become their worst nightmare. As the war in the Pacific progressed, the Japanese Navy continued to focus on battleships and cruiser-heavy fleets. They saw aircraft carriers as auxiliary vessels. Important? Yes, but secondary to the might of their great battleships. Their belief in the power of traditional naval warfare was unshakable. But the United States was quickly adapting, leveraging its carriers for long-range strikes, taking the fight to the heart of the Japanese Empire. It was becoming increasingly clear that the future of naval warfare belonged not to battleships, but to aircraft carriers. The lead-up to the Battle of Midway. The year 1942 marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had achieved a series of victories. Their forces swept across Southeast Asia, securing territories in Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Yet despite their dominance, Japan was facing mounting challenges. The U.S. Navy, although crippled at Pearl Harbor, was recovering rapidly. The Americans, unlike their Japanese counterparts, understood the growing importance of aircraft carriers. The fight for control of the Pacific was far from over. In early 1942, Japan set its sights on the island of Midway, a strategic location roughly halfway between Japan and Hawaii. Midway was critical. Its airstrip could serve as a launch point for further attacks on the United States, and its capture would allow Japan to extend its dominance across the Pacific. Japanese planners believed that by destroying the remaining American carriers at Midway, they could wipe out the last remaining threat to their naval supremacy. For the Americans, Midway was a make-or-break moment. The U.S. had suffered heavy losses in the first few months of the war, but they had already begun to learn valuable lessons. The American Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, had begun to embrace the full potential of its aircraft carriers. Nimitz understood that victory would not come through conventional battleship engagements, but through the precise, overwhelming power of naval aviation. Nimitz's forces, though still in the process of recovery, were well positioned to challenge the Japanese. At Midway, the Americans had 3 carriers: the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown, each a symbol of American resilience and innovation. These carriers, along with their accompanying fleets, would face off against Japan's 6-carrier strike force, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, believed that his fleet could strike the final blow to the Americans. He was confident in the power of his battleships and cruisers, as well as the superior size and number of Japanese aircraft. However, what Yamamoto did not account for was how much the American Navy had adapted. While Japan relied on its powerful battleships to lead the charge, the United States had placed its faith in the flexibility and reach of its carriers. In many ways, the Battle of Midway would be the first true test of whether aircraft carriers could render battleships obsolete. Intelligence played a critical role in the lead-up to the battle. U.S. codebreakers had managed to decipher Japan's naval communications and knew that Midway was Japan's next target. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Nimitz was able to position his forces with deadly precision. It was now a race against time to prepare the fleet, deploy aircraft, and engage the enemy before the Japanese forces arrived. In the sky above, the carrier's planes, armed with bombs and torpedoes, were ready to engage. The battle was set, and as June 4, 1942 approached, both sides knew that the outcome of Midway could shape the future of the Pacific War. The realization of the Japanese officers. On the morning of June 4, 1942, aboard the Japanese fleet, there was a sense of confident anticipation. The crewmen, from the high-ranking officers down to the young sailors, believed that their overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower would crush the Americans. The Japanese Navy, once the undisputed master of the Pacific, had been confident in its ability to overwhelm the U.S. forces. But as the battle unfolded, the mood on the Japanese ships began to change. It was the destruction of the Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, that marked the moment of true horror for Japan's naval officers. As they watched their aircraft carriers burn, and saw the planes that had once been their pride dive into the sea, the realization set in. They had underestimated the power of America's carriers. In the officers' quarters aboard the Japanese ships, there was disbelief at first. As the American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet descended upon the Japanese carriers, their bombs struck with devastating precision. The Japanese pilots, often regarded as some of the finest in the world, were caught off guard, unable to defend their own carriers. In a matter of minutes, their once proud ships were transformed into burning wrecks. For the Japanese officers watching from the decks, the sight of their flagship, the Akagi, sinking was more than just the loss of a ship. It was the loss of their belief in their invincibility. This was not just a defeat. It was a humiliation that shattered their sense of superiority, and in many ways, changed the course of their naval strategy. Tactical angle: the shift in naval strategy. The Battle of Midway was a dramatic demonstration of the power of aircraft carriers and the vulnerability of battleships. The Japanese Navy, despite its impressive fleet of battleships, had focused on the wrong target. Their strategy, grounded in the belief that battleships were the ultimate expression of naval strength, proved to be fatally flawed. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, had embraced the tactical flexibility of aircraft carriers, understanding that they could project power at long distances and strike without warning. The Americans had carefully honed their tactics in the months leading up to Midway, and it was here that their strategic focus on carriers paid off. The U.S. carriers, although outnumbered, were able to launch devastating airstrikes against Japan's carriers. The Japanese, on the other hand, were caught in a vulnerable position. Their planes, which could have been a devastating counterattack, were all on the deck, fueling or being prepared for another strike on the U.S. fleet. This critical mistake, lining up their planes on the decks without proper defense, allowed the American bombers to target and destroy them with deadly accuracy. From a tactical standpoint, the loss of the Japanese carriers was catastrophic. Not only did Japan lose its most valuable assets, but they also lost the ability to project power in the Pacific. The once formidable carrier strike groups that had made Japan the dominant naval power in the Pacific were now gone, and with them, Japan's ability to sustain a long-term offensive war. Technological angle: the unstoppable power of the U.S. aircraft carrier. What made America's aircraft carriers so powerful at Midway wasn't just the tactics or the bravery of the men aboard. It was the technology that powered them. At the heart of these carriers was a new kind of warfare: long-range, precision strikes that could be launched far beyond the range of traditional battleships. The U.S. carriers at Midway were equipped with radar, giving them the ability to detect incoming Japanese planes far before they reached the American fleet. This technological edge was crucial, allowing the U.S. Navy to position its aircraft for maximum impact. Additionally, the American bombers, flying from the decks of these carriers, were equipped with bomb sights that allowed them to target with deadly accuracy. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber, for instance, was a marvel of design, capable of diving at steep angles to release bombs precisely on target. Meanwhile, Japan's aircraft carriers, though formidable in their own right, were caught in a technological race they couldn't win. Japanese pilots relied on traditional methods of targeting and attack, methods that were becoming outdated in the face of American technological advancements. In this new era of warfare, the Japanese planes, though skilled and brave, were no match for the sheer firepower and precision of the American carriers. At the same time, American engineers had developed the ability to quickly adapt their technology in response to battle conditions. While Japan's naval force was tied to traditional methods of warfare, the United States was continually refining and evolving its approach. The U.S. Navy's ability to launch large-scale attacks, effectively coordinating bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes from their aircraft carriers, showed that technology, combined with strategy, had become the true backbone of modern naval warfare. The contrast between U.S. and Japanese naval command. The contrast in leadership styles between the United States and Japan during the Battle of Midway reveals much about the divergent strategies that ultimately shaped the Pacific War. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, the battle was a test of resolve and strategic vision. Nimitz, though faced with severe limitations and having suffered the loss of much of his fleet at Pearl Harbor, demonstrated an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure. His decision to place faith in his aircraft carriers, despite limited resources, was a gamble that would pay off. Nimitz's leadership was grounded in a deep understanding of both the strategic importance of Midway and the capabilities of his forces. His decision to use intelligence gathered by U.S. codebreakers, information about Japan's plans to strike Midway, was a masterstroke. By positioning his carriers in ambush, Nimitz effectively set the stage for a decisive attack. His ability to take calculated risks, trust his commanders, and maintain composure in the face of adversity made him one of the most revered leaders in military history. In contrast, Japan's naval leadership was steeped in tradition and overconfidence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, although a brilliant tactician, had a fundamental belief in the superiority of the Japanese fleet, particularly their battleships. Yamamoto's over-reliance on traditional naval doctrine, which focused on decisive fleet battles, blinded him to the changing nature of warfare. His initial underestimation of the power of aircraft carriers led to disastrous consequences at Midway. Though he had significant strategic foresight, the limitations of his rigid command structure prevented Japan from adapting quickly to new naval tactics, which ultimately sealed their fate. Yamamoto's failure to anticipate the full capabilities of American naval power, particularly the impact of American aircraft carriers, highlighted the difference in adaptability between the two sides. While Nimitz adapted and innovated, Yamamoto, despite his vast experience, remained too committed to old ideas and overestimated the ability of the Japanese fleet to dominate through sheer force. Enemy angle: Japan's overconfidence and its fatal missteps. By the time of the Battle of Midway, Japan's overconfidence had reached a dangerous zenith. Having successfully carried out the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, Japan's leadership was convinced that their naval dominance in the Pacific was unassailable. The initial victories, crushing defeats of the British and American fleets in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and other territories, had bolstered this belief. Japan's naval commanders believed that their decisive victories had left the United States with little power to counter their expansion. Yet, their strategic vision was one-dimensional, rooted in a traditional understanding of naval warfare that centered around large battleships and direct confrontations. Japan's naval superiority, in their eyes, was an unquestionable fact. As a result, they underestimated the value of smaller, more flexible aircraft carriers, which would soon prove to be their undoing. The Japanese underestimated the resilience and resourcefulness of the American Navy. Their carriers were outnumbered, and their fighters and bombers were smaller and less equipped than those of their Japanese counterparts. But the U.S. Navy had something far more powerful: adaptability. The Japanese, in contrast, had become so focused on battleship-driven strategies that they failed to see the emerging dominance of air power in naval warfare. They continued to concentrate their resources on the construction of larger and more formidable battleships, while their aircraft carriers remained secondary in importance. At Midway, Japan's fatal mistake was the belief that their superiority in numbers and firepower could overwhelm the Americans. This fatalism led them to underestimate how quickly the tides could change. As a result, they positioned their fleet and aircraft in ways that made them vulnerable to American strikes. When the Japanese carriers were hit, they were unable to recover. The very ships they believed to be their greatest assets became their biggest liabilities. Moral angle: the toll of war on the human spirit. While the Battle of Midway was a decisive military victory, it was also a reminder of the harsh realities of war. The toll it took on both the Japanese and American forces was devastating, not only in terms of physical losses, but also psychologically. For the Japanese officers and sailors aboard the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, the destruction of their ships represented the death of their pride, honor, and belief in their invincibility. In Japan, the loss of these carriers would have deep moral implications. These ships were not merely vessels of war. They were symbols of Japan's naval strength and its imperial destiny. Their destruction at Midway not only meant the loss of vital assets, but it also represented the collapse of the Japanese sense of superiority. The men who had sailed aboard them had believed in their invincibility. Their deaths in the fiery ruins of these once proud ships marked the end of an era. This would cast a long shadow over the morale of the Japanese Navy and shift the war in a direction they could not control. On the American side, the battle also took its toll. While the victory was crucial, it did not come without a price. American pilots and sailors fought bravely, knowing that Midway was their last hope to stop Japan's advance across the Pacific. Despite their success, the human cost was undeniable. The loss of life, the destruction of aircraft, and the fear of imminent defeat weighed heavily on those who fought in the battle. But for the United States, the moral impact of Midway was different. It represented the triumph of resilience, intelligence, and the willingness to fight for a cause greater than any individual. The Battle of Midway marked a pivotal point in not just the Pacific War, but in the moral fabric of both nations. For the Japanese, it was a moment of reckoning, the beginning of their slow realization that they could not dominate the Pacific by sheer force of will. For the Americans, it solidified their belief in the power of innovation, intelligence, and the courage to face seemingly insurmountable odds. The Battle of Midway unfolds. June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll in the Pacific was about to become the stage for one of the most dramatic naval battles in history. The morning sky was clear, and the water, as blue as it had always been, seemed deceptively calm. But beneath the surface, the fate of the Pacific War was shifting irrevocably. The battle began with a flurry of activity. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Yamamoto's command, launched its planes, intending to strike the American forces stationed at Midway and ultimately cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, Yamamoto's forces had made a critical miscalculation. They were not aware that the U.S. had cracked their codes, and the American fleet was ready and waiting. At 400 hours, American bombers from the USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise took to the skies. They had only one mission: to strike Japan's carriers, the heart of the Imperial Navy's fleet. A tense silence hung in the air as the first waves of Japanese planes headed toward Midway. Meanwhile, Admiral Nimitz, despite the odds, was in a position to make his move. The American aircraft, though outnumbered, carried an advantage in their ability to act on intelligence gathered in the preceding days. The Japanese had no idea that a significant portion of the U.S. fleet, including its carriers, was lurking just beyond the horizon. The first wave of American bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, launched their attack on the Japanese carriers. They managed to inflict significant damage on the fleet, but it wasn't until the second wave of American planes arrived that the true turning point occurred. As the Americans descended upon the Japanese carriers, they were met with fierce resistance from Japanese fighters, but the American pilots were undeterred. It was at this moment, the attack on the Japanese carriers, that the scales of war tipped. The Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were all struck by American dive bombers, their decks igniting in massive explosions. As the bombs fell, the Japanese pilots were caught unaware. They had all been preparing for their next attack, with their aircraft lined up on the decks, vulnerable to attack. The damage was catastrophic. The Kaga was set ablaze, and explosions ripped through the Akagi and Soryu. Within hours, all three carriers were effectively out of action, their air power and strategic significance neutralized. The battle was turning, and the Japanese officers, many of whom had underestimated the American carriers, were now experiencing the reality of their tactical errors. The once unshakable confidence of the Japanese Navy was shattered, and the once unimaginable idea of losing the most powerful carriers in the fleet was becoming a grim reality. By midday, the final blow came. The Hiryu, Japan's last remaining carrier, launched a desperate counterattack in an attempt to sink the USS Yorktown. The Hiryu's planes successfully struck the American carrier, severely damaging it. But the counterattack would prove to be in vain. The U.S. Navy, resilient and prepared, launched a final wave of bombers, devastating the Hiryu and sending it to the bottom of the Pacific. As the afternoon wore on, the once proud Japanese fleet, once the epitome of naval power, had been decimated. 4 of their fleet carriers were gone, and with them, the heart of Japan's naval strength. The Japanese officers, in disbelief, watched as their once dominant fleet was reduced to smoldering wrecks. The realization that they had underestimated the power of America's aircraft carriers, vessels they had dismissed as secondary, was undeniable. Japan's invincibility was shattered in those few hours. The fallout of Midway and the Japanese realization. As the last flames of the Japanese carriers flickered out in the distance, the consequences of the Battle of Midway were already being felt throughout the Pacific. The loss of 4 carriers in a single day was a blow to Japan that could never be fully recovered from. These ships were not just vessels. They were the heart of Japan's naval superiority, its pride, and its future strategy. Their destruction was a catastrophic blow to Japan's ability to project power, and the full scope of the loss would become clear over the coming weeks. For Admiral Yamamoto, the aftermath of Midway was a devastating realization. His plan, once thought to be foolproof, had crumbled under the weight of American innovation and preparedness. The Japanese officers, having watched their carriers burn, were now faced with the undeniable truth. Their fleet, once considered the most formidable in the world, had been decisively defeated. The American aircraft carriers, once dismissed as an auxiliary force, had proven themselves as the most formidable weapon in naval warfare. The scale of Japan's defeat at Midway began to sink in. Not only had Japan lost 4 carriers, but they had also lost nearly 250 aircraft and hundreds of trained pilots, assets that would take years to replace. These losses severely crippled Japan's ability to launch large-scale offensives in the Pacific. Furthermore, Japan's morale took a massive hit. What had been a fleet on the verge of total dominance now lay in ruins, and with it, their once unquestioned belief in the invincibility of their naval power. As the months passed, Japan's naval commanders were forced to confront a grim reality. Without their carriers, they could no longer dictate the course of the war in the Pacific. The United States, meanwhile, had proven its ability to innovate and adapt in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The loss at Midway would mark a crucial turning point in the Pacific War, as Japan's expansion would be halted, and the balance of naval power would shift decisively in favor of the United States. Despite this, Yamamoto and the Japanese leadership would not immediately admit defeat. The battle had been devastating, but the war was far from over. Japan still held a vast empire, and its fleet, although now crippled, was not yet fully out of the fight. However, in the hearts and minds of Japan's officers, a fundamental shift had occurred. The realization that their greatest weapon, their carriers, had been destroyed, left a deep scar. They now understood that their once unassailable position in the Pacific had been shattered by an enemy they had dismissed as weaker, slower, and less sophisticated. Meanwhile, the United States, despite suffering losses, had emerged from the battle with a sense of triumph and renewed determination. The destruction of the Japanese carriers not only eliminated a direct threat, but also demonstrated the superior capabilities of U.S. naval technology and strategy. The American leadership, having fought back from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, now knew that they had turned the tide. It was the beginning of a relentless series of victories that would ultimately lead to Japan's surrender in 1945. Immediate consequences for Japan. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Midway was one of devastating loss for Japan, a country that had once believed itself to be the dominant naval power in the Pacific. 4 of Japan's most formidable aircraft carriers had been sunk in a matter of hours, and with them, the essential component of their naval fleet, their air power. The destruction of the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu was a monumental blow that no amount of training or leadership could undo. The losses were not merely tactical, they were strategic and psychological. In the span of a single battle, Japan had lost over 250 aircraft, some of the most experienced pilots in the fleet, and its capacity to launch large-scale carrier operations. These carriers were the heart of the Imperial Navy's offensive capabilities. Without them, Japan could no longer initiate sustained campaigns in the Pacific. The inability to defend against American airstrikes left Japan's remaining naval forces vulnerable. In the immediate aftermath, Japan attempted to regroup and recover. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff, though deeply shaken, were determined not to show weakness. The Japanese Navy, despite its significant losses, still had a sizable fleet, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. However, their ability to control the Pacific had been fatally undermined. The inability to effectively replace their lost carriers and trained pilots left Japan in a prolonged state of vulnerability. The remaining aircraft carriers, including the Zuikaku and Shokaku, were now the last standing symbols of Japan's naval power. But their loss at Midway had already set in motion a chain of events that would gradually push the Japanese Navy into a defensive posture for the rest of the war. The emotional toll of Midway on Japan's naval officers was profound. The commanders who had so long believed in the superiority of their fleet could no longer deny the power of America's carriers. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the Pacific had been shattered. What had once been an unquestioned certainty, the overwhelming might of Japan's carrier fleet, had now become a historical relic. The battle proved that no amount of arrogance, no matter how deeply rooted, could protect against the realities of modern warfare. The shift in global naval power. In the broader context, the Battle of Midway marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War, one that shifted the balance of naval power irrevocably in favor of the United States. The Americans, having suffered enormous losses at Pearl Harbor, now stood poised to take the fight directly to Japan. With the sinking of Japan's 4 carriers, the United States had removed the heart of Japan's offensive capability. This victory, although not without its own cost, would prove to be the first in a series of American triumphs that would ultimately lead to Japan's downfall. For the United States, Midway represented a moment of strategic clarity. The lesson of the battle was clear. Aircraft carriers had become the backbone of naval warfare. The U.S. Navy, with its carriers as the centerpiece, now dominated the Pacific. The destruction of Japan's fleet meant that the Americans could now move forward with confidence, knowing that they had the upper hand. The United States would go on to win key victories at Guadalcanal, the Marianas, and Iwo Jima, each one further cementing the role of aircraft carriers as the central force in Pacific naval battles. But while Midway was a decisive victory for the U.S., it was also a sobering reminder of the brutality and unpredictability of war. Both sides had paid a heavy price, and the aftermath was far from certain. The United States, although victorious, had lost the USS Yorktown in the battle, along with many of its best pilots. The American pilots who had launched the successful attacks were hailed as heroes, but the cost of victory was not lost on them. For the men who fought at Midway, it was a battle that required sacrifice, bravery, and, above all, the willingness to adapt to new forms of warfare. For Japan, the battle was the beginning of a slow decline. With the loss of its carriers, Japan's ability to control the Pacific was irrevocably damaged. They would continue to fight fiercely, but the strategic initiative had passed to the United States. The Japanese Navy, once a symbol of dominance and pride, would now be forced to fight from a position of retreat. The Battle of Midway marked the moment when Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific began to unravel, and the relentless counteroffensive by the United States would only intensify in the years to come. The Battle of Midway, while a victory for the United States, was also a profound moment in the history of warfare. It was a battle of innovation against tradition, a clash between the old guard of battleship-centric naval power and the rising dominance of aircraft carriers. In the end, it was the adaptability of the United States Navy, the ability to evolve in the face of adversity, that defined the outcome. For Japan, Midway was a painful reminder of the consequences of overconfidence. The loss of 4 carriers in a single battle not only crippled their naval capacity, but also shattered their morale. The psychological blow to Japan's officers and sailors was as significant as the physical destruction of their fleet. The belief in their invincibility, which had been their guiding principle, was crushed, and with it, the core of their naval strategy. The battle also marked a shift in the nature of global warfare. Aircraft carriers would no longer be seen as auxiliary vessels or secondary to battleships. Midway proved that they were, in fact, the future of naval power, capable of striking at the heart of an enemy fleet, changing the course of a war from hundreds of miles away. The lesson of Midway was clear. Technological innovation, combined with strategic brilliance, could alter the very fabric of military conflict. For the United States, Midway was a turning point, not just in the Pacific War, but in their journey towards global dominance. The victory gave them the momentum they needed to launch a series of offensives that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. But even in victory, there was a solemn recognition of the cost of war, the lives lost, the planes destroyed, and the men who would never return home. The Battle of Midway serves as a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare, where the outcome can hinge on a single moment of ingenuity or a single miscalculation. It reminds us that history is often shaped by those moments when innovation outpaces tradition, and when the courage to adapt can turn the tide of battle. As the Pacific War raged on, the lessons of Midway would resonate far beyond the battlefield, echoing through the strategy and tactics of future conflicts. The battle for the Pacific was far from over, but the shifting of power in the Pacific had already begun. Midway was more than a victory. It was the moment that changed the course of history, defining the future of naval warfare and the fate of nations.